Welcome to the History Whisperer. Today, we step back into an era of unparalleled beauty and genius, the Renaissance. But behind the masterpieces of Da Vinci and the grand cathedrals lay a brutal reality where every day was a battle for survival. Why was it so difficult to stay alive in this golden age? Before we uncover these dark secrets, please take a moment to subscribe and like this video if you find peace in our historical journeys. Now, find a comfortable position, lean back, and let the whispers of the past surround you. Let's begin our journey into the shadows of the Renaissance. Hello, dear history and sleep friends. We are together again on a new night. Slowly close your eyes. Step away from the chaos of the outside world. Because tonight, I will take you to an era far beyond time, illuminated by brushstrokes, yet whose dark streets never disappeared. When you hear the name Renaissance, perhaps divine figures carved onto ceilings by Michelangelo come to mind. Maybe Leonardo's notebooks, the rise of the printing press, the awakening of science. But tonight, we will look at the background of those paintings, and I will ask you, would you really want to live there? Because those streets might be ornate, but they smelled. Those palaces were magnificent, but you did not belong to those palaces. And in this age where science rose, you could be burned for just an idea. Tonight, we will pursue the question of why you couldn't have survived if you lived in Renaissance Europe, and history will whisper the answer. You, on the other hand, will fall into a peaceful sleep. If you are ready, let us advance with silent steps through the misty streets of history. Starting the day in the Renaissance, the first thing you feel when you open your eyes is not the dampness of your pillow. Because you don't have a pillow anyway. You are laid on a sack filled with straw, and the itchiness you feel on your back is the morning greeting of the insects living inside, not the bed. Being an average person in Renaissance Europe is difficult enough to make you grateful for even your worst morning today. What you call a house is a one-room shelter made of stone or mud brick. There is no heating system. Perhaps there is a hearth in the corner, but assuming it went out during the night, you wake up with your body nearly frozen from the cold with the first lights of the morning. This is how you start the day. You look for a mirror, perhaps, but mirrors were not things found in every home during that period. Besides, finding water is an issue. Where will you find clean water to wash your hands and face? If you are lucky, there is a fountain near the house. But this time, it is your turn to carry the bucket. So, as soon as you wake up, a physical struggle begins rather than body hygiene. Now let's come to the main issue, nature's remedy, the toilet. Forget that word. Skip that luxury. The concept of a toilet in today's sense had not yet formed in Renaissance Europe. Even in royal palaces, stone gutters opening to the backyard or secret chairs were used instead of private rooms. If you are one of the common folk, you would have done your business into a chamber pot, standing in the corner of the room throughout the night. Emptying it outside after closing its lid in the morning is also one of your duties. When you step outside, another reality greets you. Cities are not clean. Sewage poured into the street, trash, animal waste, all combine to greet you with a stench that stings the nose. People do not mind each other while using the toilet in the street in the early hours of the morning. Besides, concepts like shame and privacy are not as widespread as they are today. Witnessing a woman urinating in the morning or a man defecating at a street corner is one of the ordinary morning rituals of that period. This lack of hygiene in cities is not just disturbing, but deadly. Because diseases spread as a result of this lack of sewage. Plague, dysentery, typhus. Every day you cannot perform your morning cleaning, your risk of death increases by one more step. But for the person of that period, this is normal, because nobody knows any better. Science has not advanced, and microbes have not yet been discovered. The belief called bad air is accepted as the cause of diseases. That's why people hold perfume bottles to their noses or burn incense in the morning. They might not get rid of the smell, but these behaviors alleviate the fear of death a little bit. At this point, the class difference makes itself felt. If you are wealthy, a servant wakes you up in the morning. They empty the ceramic chamber pot placed under you. Hot water is brought beside you before you even open your eyes. You might even have a chance to wipe your face with lavender water. But still, these things we call luxury are far behind even today's most mediocre hotel room, because technology, hygiene, and comfort have not even been born yet. If you are a peasant, the situation is even more dire. You wake up with animal sounds in the morning. Your first job is likely to go to the barn, milk the cow, feed the chickens, and if you have a small plot of land, dig it. Still no toilet. The pit behind the barn or behind the bushes is your toilet. You must be careful there too. It is possible to encounter a snake, a rat, or even another peasant. Again, there is no concept of privacy, but the feeling of shame is instinctive. And under these conditions, your day begins. You are hungry. The bread in your hand is stale. If you can find something to spread on it, be grateful. Perhaps a bit of cheese, a bit of dried meat. But these are not always available. There is no meal culture known as breakfast. When the hunger that will last all day combines with your morning physical effort, it leaves you exhausted. You are only at the beginning of the day, but your body is worn out. Do not be deceived by the name Renaissance. The rise of art, the birth of science, the shining of culture, all are trapped within the walls of palaces or the stained glass of churches. If you are an ordinary person of this magnificent age, you live your mornings not like a dream, but literally like a struggle. And perhaps your biggest dream is to one day wake up to a world where there is actually a toilet. If you are not a noble, you have almost no rights. Your stomach is growling. The morning frost has not yet passed. The inside of the house is colder than the outside. There is no bread before you, no soup. Only some onions left from last night and a few pieces of dried barley bread. But what's worse is you have no right to object to this, because you are the common people. Neither does your family have a coat of arms, nor are you a relative of a lord. You were just born, but you were born in the wrong class. The Renaissance is a period identified in most of our minds with culture, art, and science. However, behind this glittering image, a class system ruled that trapped people into cages from the moment they were born. If you were a noble, the law was on your side. If not, the law would fall on you like a stone. Your word would not count in court. If a noble wanted to laugh at your house, you had no right to stop them, because property was a privilege that came with bloodline. In other words, even what was yours was not actually yours. Everything would start with birth. If you were born as the son of a noble, you would have a wet nurse. Then you would have private tutors, teachers who knew Latin, and masters who gave sword lessons. There would be other children growing up with you, but they would all be servants. They would clear your path as you walked. But if another baby born in the same year was the child of an ordinary peasant, their life would pass with mud, disease, and obedience. Being a noble was not just a privilege, but an invisible armor. You weren't talked about. You weren't questioned. You were only respected. While they chose fabrics for their clothes, you would pray that the hems of your clothes weren't torn. You would be the child polishing their shoes while they danced. While they fell in love, you were the one carrying water to the woman they served. You lived in the same city, but their sun never rose upon you, and things did not end here. Imagine, a crime was committed. You are the guilty one. But if the other party was noble, evidence was not needed for you to be guilty. Not even testimony was needed. His word was enough, because his blood was more valuable. Yours was merely a liquid that could be shed into the ground just because it was blood. Even your right to marriage was determined by your class. Falling in love with a noble? Don't make me laugh. There could only be one result for this: either a beating, exile, or living hidden under a bridge. But still, you would be the one blamed, because you didn't know your place. And children, when your child was born, there would be no promise of a future for them. They would be a farmer, a blacksmith, or a servant just like you. Their only duty would be to create a living space for their master's child. They couldn't even play the same games, because even some toys belonged to classes. There were classes even in the marketplace. You would stand in line, but when a noble person came, your turn would become theirs. Even your sentences were chosen according to your class. Saying the word master to the wrong person could cause great trouble for you. Even making eye contact was dangerous. Staring at a noble could be considered a cause of death. And while all this was happening, you had no voice, because they had taught you to remain silent. The class you were born into was your nature. It was unchangeable, unquestionable, and could not be opposed. In other words, you were condemned the moment you were born. That's why you are not in the magical paintings of the Renaissance. Michelangelo doesn't draw you. Leonardo doesn't write about you, because you are from the invisible class. You are one of the millions who are crushed on that thin line between existing and vanishing, but do not speak out. And now I ask you, living in the Renaissance? Perhaps for art, yes, but for humanity, it was not so at all. When it comes to clothing, looking stylish was a luxury, and being clean was impossible. Imagine standing in front of a mirror, but no, it was impossible for you to even find that mirror. Because during the Middle Ages and after, the mirror was a luxury belonging to the nobles. The brightest thing you could clearly see your face in might be a puddle, and that puddle was probably muddy. You certainly had clothes, but only 2 sets, one for daily chores and the other for Sunday Mass or funerals. Each was sewn from coarse wool fabric. It was heavy, itchy, and would remain constantly damp. They were not washed. There was no water to wash them anyway, nor soap. Water was not for cleaning, but for survival. It had to be drunk. That's why you would wear your clothes the same way for months, sometimes even years. On cold days, the only thing that would keep you warm was these thick fabrics you wore in layers. But when summer came, things changed. Because this time, sweat and dirt would begin to accumulate like mud on your skin. There was no underwear in the lower classes. For cleanliness, the only hope was the public baths held at certain times of the year. But even going to them was an adventure in itself. It was far, crowded, and dangerous. Let's talk a bit about shoes. If you had a pair of shoes, you were lucky. Most people, especially children, walked around barefoot. You were in direct contact with mud, stones, and thorns. Even if there were shoes, they were made of leather but had no inner lining. They were damp and smelled foul. They would open wounds by rubbing against your feet, but you would still have to wear those shoes. And let's look at the nobles. Their clothes were as if they came from another world. Silk, velvet, lace. Clothes were used not only for protection, but as a class indicator. Even color was a symbol of wealth. Vibrant colors like red, purple, and golden yellow were only for the rich. The dyes used to obtain these colors were so expensive that a roll of fabric could cost almost as much as a house. There were sumptuary laws. Yes, you heard right. The state told you what to wear. It was determined by laws. If you were a farmer, you couldn't wear silk. If you were a craftsman, you couldn't wear certain hats, because this was a barrier defining class boundaries. The clothes you wore showed who you were, and you couldn't cross that boundary. What about women? For them, things were even more complicated. A woman had to look clean, elegant, and modest. But with what water, what soap, what fabric? They had to cover their heads. If their hair were seen, they would be considered immoral. But even finding a clean enough cloth to cover their hair was an issue. Therefore, you might have to tie a piece of an old sack on your head. And the smells. While the streets smelled like sewage, people's bodies were no different. Body odor was so normal that people would spray herbs, incense, or even vinegar on themselves to cover these smells. Perfume? That belonged to the palaces. As for your smell, no one would even care. Shaving was also difficult. Razors were expensive, and barbers were only for the nobles. A toothbrush? No. Your teeth would turn black and even fall out over time, but no one would judge you for this because everyone was in the same situation. Being clean was not a luxury, it was impossible. Despite all this, people loved to dress up. Being clean might be impossible, but having your clothes sit properly meant receiving a bit of respect. That's why they would try to dress properly, even if patched. And now let's ask, would you want to look stylish in Renaissance Europe? Perhaps yes, but if you want to be clean, you should go to the future, not the past. As for dancing with hunger, what were the poor eating while the rich were feasting? You are hungry. It's been hours since you woke up, but your stomach is still empty. After a sleepless night spent in a room with stone walls and no stove, it is finally time to eat. So what will you eat? Tell me, do you have wheat in your house? Butter, meat, or milk? No. Then you are one of the millions of poor living in Renaissance Europe, and this is the beginning of another day spent with hunger for you. When the Renaissance is mentioned, most of us think of generous meals, long banquet tables, and royal feasts. But this was only for the upper class. For the vast masses of people, food was a difficult struggle for survival. The lower classes usually ate only 1 or 2 meals a day, and these meals consisted of dry bread, some boiled vegetables, and rarely a few beans or onions. Bread was the staple food, but the bread everyone ate was not the same. While the nobles ate soft bread made from white flour, the bread of the people was made from black flour, crusty, hard as stone, and the kind that strained the stomach. Reaching wheat flour was almost as difficult as finding gold. Bread was ground in stone mills, but stone fragments would mix into the flour over time, becoming hard enough to break teeth. Losing teeth was not surprising because of this. The poor lived for years, gnawing on this stony bread. Meat? Forget about it. Meat only reached the hands of the people during holidays, or through alms distributed by a benefactor. Instead of meat, the poor would make soup by boiling internal organs or chopping vegetables into bone broth. In other words, what was called meat broth was most of the time just bone kept in water for a few hours. On the tables of the rich, however, the situation was completely different. Wild boar, pheasant, partridge, beef, even swan and peacock were served. Moreover, these meats were used not only for eating, but also for show. Sometimes birds were placed on the table decorated with their feathers, and the nobles enjoyed a visual feast. It wasn't enough to be full. The eyes also had to be satisfied. Vegetables had a large place in the diet of the people, but the people of that period were afraid of raw vegetables. Due to the belief called coldness, it was believed that anything uncooked would make the body sick. Therefore, everything was definitely boiled or roasted, which caused vitamins to be lost. Salad? A huge luxury. Cabbage and leeks? If available, great, but most of the time they made do with herbs collected from nature. Drinking water was a source of problems. Most water sources were dirty and spread disease, so people drank beer and wine because they thought it was safer. Yes, even children. Beer at that time was like a kind of nutritional supplement. Its alcohol content was low and its calories were high. Thus, it both substituted for water and filled the stomach a bit. Well, did everyone have milk, cows, and goats? Number. Raising animals was difficult. If there was milk, it was first given to the children, and cheese was made with the rest. For the poor people, even milk and dairy products were rare. As for cheese, it was generally a hard and sour-smelling food made to last a long time by salting. Fresh cheese was only a guest on the tables of the rich. Cooking was also a struggle in itself. There were hearths in the houses, but it was often not easy to find wood. Therefore, people would do their cooking in daylight, and did not have the luxury of storing food at night. This situation became even more difficult in the winter months. People were forced to consume moldy bread or reheated stale meals. And the sweets. If you were a Renaissance pauper, dessert was a fairy tale for you. Honey was expensive. Sugar, on the other hand, was literally equivalent to gold. Eating sweets was perhaps possible at a wedding or with candies distributed in the church. Other than that, sweets were a dream. This whole picture actually reveals the class distortion of Renaissance Europe. While those at the top were raising glasses at magnificent feasts, those below were preying on empty stomachs. In the same age, in the same city, while one was eating stuffed swan, the other was trying to eat a piece of stale bread by soaking it. Food was not just about filling the stomach. It was something that determined who you were, how long you lived, and even what you believed in. Therefore, the dining table in the Renaissance was not just a place where food was eaten. It was a stage where classes, injustice, and the war for survival were exhibited. So yes, dancing with hunger was a daily routine, a despair for most people of that age, and this dance was often performed not on full stomachs, but with empty bellies. The plague did not end, it returned. The black shadows of the Renaissance. You hear a groan while passing through the street. This sound coming from inside a stone house with its door left half open resembles the desperate struggle of a patient. You stop for a moment and look. Inside there is a man lying on straw spread on the ground. His body is trembling, his eyes are sunken, and his lips are parched. The hands of the woman sitting next to him are in her lap, her eyes vacant. The only words falling from her mouth are, "It has started again." A nightmare still lives within the Enlightenment dream of the Renaissance, the plague. Yes, it didn't end. The first great wave of the Black Death had taken a third of Europe in the 14th century. But people tend to forget, especially when hopes flourish and a renaissance is experienced with art and science. However, death continued to wander in the streets, inside the houses and in the markets, not just in history books. Those magnificent paintings, statues, and inventions that come to mind when the Renaissance era is mentioned were all shaped in the shadow of the fear of death. because the plague came back periodically. These second and third waves were felt even more harshly in some cities than the first. Epidemics would often start silently. A few patients, a few dead, then the bells would start to ring. Priests would recite funeral prayers by heart. Now, a prayer to be passed over quickly would be sprinkled over the corpses instead of soil. And people tried to understand, why again? Was cleanliness lacking? Was there too much sin? Had the cats been destroyed? Yes, perhaps the effects of those cat massacres in the Middle Ages were still continuing. The rats surrounding the cities and the fleas they carried were the messengers bearing this shadowy curse. Science was still in its infancy. Concepts like pasteurization and germ theory did not exist yet. People believed in a divine punishment. They looked at the positions of the stars. They blamed magic and curses, but could find no remedy. When the plague returned, every segment of society froze with the same fear again. Nobles left the cities. Peasants left their fields. Merchants closed their shops without being able to sell their goods. Everyone was imprisoned inside the same quarantine. The strange thing was this: people had not learned lessons from previous epidemics. The same mistakes were repeated. Mass graves were dug again. Masked doctors wandered the streets again. But there was no solution. Because society was not prepared for the epidemic, not only financially, but also mentally. In some places, the people rebelled. They held the houses of God, namely the churches, responsible. Some monks whipped themselves in the streets to punish themselves. When people realized they could not escape death, they tried to give it meaning. The plague was no longer just a disease. It was a test, a purification, perhaps a harbinger of a new age. And art began to speak again. Paintings depicting the plague, skeleton figures, people dancing with death. Death became ordinary in paintings. In literature, the word death was no longer just an end, but a character. People recognized it, accepted it, but did not stop fearing it. This black shadow was always hidden behind the brightest showcases of the Renaissance. There was a fear of death in every brushstroke, in every stone carving. Perhaps this was what made the Renaissance so powerful. The desire to cling to life with all one's might was because death was felt on the back of the neck at every moment. The plague did not end. It only took a break. And Renaissance Europe had to learn to live with this reality. Art sprouted in the streets where corpses were carried. Music echoed within the silent cries. Hope was sought like a candlelight in the darkness. But no one forgot. The black shadow could always come back. And perhaps it is most then that a human truly recreates themselves. A dentist? No. A blacksmith. Are you ready to meet the pain? You wake up in the crack of dawn. You hardly slept last night because of the pain in your tooth. Your jaw is throbbing. What will you do? There is no pharmacy, no painkillers. Antibiotics haven't been discovered yet anyway. You grit your teeth and it comes to your mind. There was someone in the village who understood teeth. But he is not a doctor. He is a blacksmith. Yes, you heard right. If you were an ordinary peasant in Renaissance Europe, the person you could have your tooth pulled by was often a blacksmith, a butcher, or a craftsman who used to sharpen knives but now looked after health matters. Because access to real doctors is both difficult and expensive. Besides, most doctors don't understand much about dental work either. Teeth are not their field. A tooth is a torture, not a cure. You enter the blacksmith shop. There is the smell of burnt metal, smoke coming from the hearth, and rusty tools everywhere. It's your turn. Your tooth needs to be pulled. No anesthesia, no sedatives, only strength, speed, and prayer. The blacksmith first heats a thick tool similar to pliers in the fire because he thinks it will come out more easily if he pulls it with hot metal. Perhaps it's just to disinfect it, but no one is sure. He hands you a piece of wood. Quote 3, he says, so you don't swallow your tongue instead of your tooth. Then he thrusts the tool into your mouth in one go. He pulls, twists, and wrenches. Your screams echo throughout the street, but no one finds it strange, because this is normal. Did your tooth come out? Maybe, but your gums are shredded and your mouth is full of blood. Now what will you do? Nothing. You will press some ash and rub it with garlic. Maybe a priest will come and pray so you don't get an infection. There is no such thing as dental health in the Renaissance. Teeth fall out over time. Decay is accepted as fate. Bad breath is so common that no one questions anyone's breath. Sugar is a luxury item reachable by the rich. But flour products, stale bread, and poorly cooked meats cause torture to everyone's teeth. But the most terrifying ones were the abscesses in the jaw. These sometimes spread to the brain, and people died within weeks. They died because of a tooth. A tooth, a small cavity, a hole that ended a life because it was not treated. And what about those who did not want to lose their teeth? They were also desperate. For dentures, the most common solution of the period was animal bone. Yes, you heard right. Dentures made from horse teeth, wooden teeth, or even prosthetics prepared with real teeth taken from some corpses. These prosthetics were expensive, but did they work? No. Speaking was difficult, chewing was impossible, but at least it looked as if something was there. In Renaissance Europe, pain itself had become normalized. People were used to living with toothaches, so much so that for some, this pain was seen as a test from God, an atonement for sins. Suffering from a toothache was considered a sign of holy patience. A simple cavity that we dismiss by taking a painkiller today could bring you face to face with death in that age. And in that helplessness, the only hope was, yes, a blacksmith. If your tooth aches tomorrow morning, remember to be grateful for today, because you can go to a dentist, not a blacksmith. What a great blessing, isn't it? Now close your eyes and think. Every filling in your mouth, every brushing, and even that chair in the waiting room is actually a gift from a traveler in time. And that is why you could not have survived in the Renaissance. Drinking water? It was the same as taking a risk of death. Think about it. You have worked under the summer sun. Sweat is dripping from your forehead. Your throat is parched. You long for a sip of water. You look around, but there is no fountain, no bottle. There is certainly no modern water purifier. Before you is only a murky, stagnant puddle, or perhaps a bucket. But you know that this water will bring you disease rather than quench your thirst. In Renaissance Europe, drinking water was almost like suicide, because at that time, water was a disguised form of death, rather than a source of life. What you called drinking water back then was obtained not from fountains in city centers, but mostly from wells behind houses or nearby streams. But these streams were places where people washed their clothes, animals drank water, and sometimes even the dead were washed. Feces, trash, urine, or animal carcasses mixing into the water were carriers of invisible but deadly enemies: typhus, dysentery, cholera, and many more. People did not know that these diseases came from microbes. According to them, disease was bad air or the wrath of God. Therefore, one had to think twice before drinking a glass of water. Interestingly, many people drank beer or wine instead of water at that time. Of course, a glass of wine at breakfast may sound crazy, but in that period it was seen as a way of survival. Because beer and wine contained fewer microbes during the fermentation process compared to water. In other words, alcohol could keep you alive in addition to suppressing thirst. Of course, this brought other problems with it. Alcohol addiction, malnutrition, and liver problems were the fate of the poor. Therefore, being born in the Renaissance meant dancing with death in every sip. On one hand, heat, on the other, thirst. Moreover, even your most basic instinct, the desire to sustain life, could put you in danger. That is why special wells were opened for the rich. Water jugs were put through special processes. Water kept in silver containers in palaces was a privilege unreachable by the public. In some cities, men carrying clean water were even put on salary by wealthy families. Their duty was only to bring safe drinking water to the lady of the house or the children. If you were poor, you would go and drink whatever you found. If you were lucky, you only had a stomach ache. If you were unlucky, your grave would be dug. In an age where water was so dangerous, it was almost impossible to talk about a concept called hygiene. Hands were wiped with pieces of cloth, not soap. Teeth were picked with wooden sticks instead of miswak. People thought that the less they used water, the healthier they would stay. Because in the past, it was believed that bathing brought disease. Therefore, not only drinking, but also bathing, cleaning, or even performing ablution before praying was becoming risky. People living in villages would sometimes try their luck by collecting rainwater, but in cities, even this was almost impossible, because the places where rain collected were usually covered with mud and filth. The idea of clean rainwater was valid for only a few minutes. Then everything turned back into a mixture full of bacteria. In the houses of the rich, water flowing from the roofs was collected, filtered, and preserved in clay vessels. But the public was still condemned to wells and riverbanks. In other words, waking up one morning and thinking, "What should I drink today?" was a very luxurious question for the person of that period. The real question was this: will what I drink today kill me? The answer to this question was mostly unknown. You would just accept your fate and take a sip, perhaps believing that God would protect you. And sometimes just that one sip would open the door to diseases that would make you writhe for days. Living in Renaissance Europe meant struggling not only with wars, diseases, and class distinctions, but also with the unknowns behind a glass of water. When you turn on your sink and drink water in the modern age, perhaps you never think about this, but know that once, reaching that water was a privilege, and that privilege never visited most people. That is why, if you lived in the Renaissance, you would have to struggle not only with hunger, but also with thirst. Moreover, this struggle began anew every day. Those who used soap were looked upon with suspicion. Cleanliness was almost a sin. The first light of morning seeps not through your window, but through the gap in the wooden door. The quilt over you is not wool, but straw. You get up, but you do not change the sweaty shirt on you, because getting cleaned is not such an easy or normal thing in this age. Yes, perhaps you will stop by the church today, perhaps the market, but you have no plans such as bathing, because in this century, Cleanliness is not a habit. For some, it is even a dangerous act, because people still believe that water introduces diseases into the body and soap. Using soap, especially regularly, can cause strange looks. It is seen as a kind of perversion by some. The effects of the understanding coming from the Middle Ages continue. The Renaissance might be elevating thought, art, and science, but the concept of hygiene has not yet taken its share from this revolution. In fact, unfortunately, the Church prefers dogmas instead of science in this regard. The idea, if the body is dirty, the soul remains clean, is so widespread that people who do not bathe for weeks or months carry this situation with pride, as if wearing a medal of honor. The thought that getting clean can stain the soul is even more oppressive, especially among women, because their beauty is considered innocent along with their natural dirt. Soap is rare. Most of the time, this mixture made of animal fat and ash is heavy-smelling and expensive. Its production is also limited. Since it is reachable only by wealthy segments, using soap is, in a sense, an indicator of weirdness rather than wealth. As for the poor, they settle for river water, but only a few times a year. Other than that, smelling bad is an ordinary situation in this age, and the bad part is that no one is bothered by this situation. Perfume? That too is a kind of mask. Especially in the French courts, men and women prefer applying scents over themselves instead of bathing. Scent is for suppressing scent. People who cannot reach cleanliness try to purify themselves by suppressing odors. What happens if someone who uses soap emerges among all this? Eyes turn to them. They are looked upon with suspicion. Whispers begin. Who is this? Why is he dealing with such things? What is he hiding? Because the unusual is always terrifying. Among the public, someone who washes with soap is seen as someone overly concerned with their body, a narcissist, or perhaps even someone morally slippery. Yet, a soapy body could be the key to a healthier life. But there are very few who know this, and that minority is suppressed by the majority. Because reaching knowledge is difficult, and standing against traditions is dangerous. Churches, on the other hand, approach the issue of cleanliness very carefully. In Christianity, baptism is done with water. But other than that, the meeting of the body with water is encouraged only in special circumstances. Even nuns and priests bathe very rarely throughout the year. In fact, in the life stories of some saints, the fact that they never bathed is told as a source of pride. This thought also affects the public. People become focused not on when they should bathe, but on when not bathing will be rewarded. In the midst of all this, life is not easy for someone who uses soap. Being clean is equivalent to being a sinner in some places. And if you were born in such an age, you might have to face being excluded by society while wanting to purify your body. Maybe you just wanted to smell a little better, but people are not at a level to understand this. And over time you learn. In Renaissance Europe, there is a habit of odor rather than a need for cleanliness. People are concerned with washing their thoughts, not their bodies. And perhaps you met soap. Maybe you learned what bathing means, but those around you still keep the past alive in their old smells. That is why be careful while soap is in your hand, because cleanliness can leave you alone in this age. If you clash with religion, you will be burned, just as dangerous as beliefs. What else is there? Close your eyes. You are in Renaissance Europe. You have only one idea in your head, thinking, questioning, learning. But that is exactly why you are making a fatal mistake, because in the age you live in, even thinking can be a crime. The Renaissance is known as a period where art, science, and humanism rose. However, this does not mean there was freedom in every corner. If you want to reach knowledge, you must first pass through the darkness. And this darkness is often the shadow of the church. In that period, religion was not just a belief system. It was also a control mechanism. It was the authority that shaped society, made laws, determined punishments, and managed every area of life. The church was above not only God's people, but also the king. People speaking in the name of God could suppress ideas more sharply than a sword. If you thought differently, for example, if you advocated that the earth revolves around the sun, you can guess what would happen to you. As in the case of Galileo Galilei, those dealing with science were either silenced or forced to swallow their thoughts. Although the Renaissance was the birth of free thought, it was also one of the periods where this thought was punished the most. Even for a middle-class person, clashing with religion could be fatal. Witch hunts, inquisition courts, excommunications, and public executions were all a theater of horror staged for faith to remain. Being tried in these courts often meant being declared guilty on the very first day. Evidence was not sought. Confessions were forced, through torture, by being left hungry, or with the claim that you misinterpreted religious texts. In other words, you had to think 10 times before speaking your ideas in the Renaissance. If you were a poet, you had to speak with metaphors. If a painter, with symbols. If a scientist, with codes. Otherwise, your ideas could be the spark of the fire that burned you. Interestingly, many people were hungry for knowledge in this period. Everyone wanted to learn. But reaching correct information was not easy, because the control of information was in the hands of the church. Even the printing press faced censorship in its early years. For some, the public learning, reading, and thinking meant a threat, and this perception of threat hit the innocent the most. Looking back today, these people may seem barbaric or ignorant to us. But remember that they too were within an order. They were trapped in the triangle of fear, ignorance, and authority. Religion was both their refuge and their prison, and every individual who wanted to escape this prison was either declared insane or burned. In short, if you lived in the Renaissance, you would need to think a few times before openly stating your ideas about religion, because it was possible to be burned with a book or executed with a single sentence. Therefore, one must ask, which age is freer? Which is more brutal? Witch hunts. Your life could darken with just a rumor. Close your eyes and imagine. You are in a cold village house. The wind is howling outside. You haven't spoken to your neighbor for a few days. The cow in your garden got sick. It hasn't rained for a week. And that is exactly why you hear your name being called when the church bells ring in the morning. Quote 8. A rumor, a look, a smell, the death of an animal, or sleeping with your window open at night. All can change your life forever, because you are now in a dangerous age. In the Middle Ages and after, even rumors were death warrants. Witch hunts were not limited to the burning of a few women. Thousands of people were forced to accept their guilt through torture, sometimes for the simplest reasons. Quote 9, quote 10, quote 11, quote 12, quote 13. Even such claims were enough, because witchcraft was a crime difficult to understand, defend, and prove. And the most dangerous thing was fear itself. In this period, many women were targeted just because they lived alone. Widowhood, poverty, or being a little different from society, all were enough to declare you a witch. Men also became victims from time to time. But this hunt was a dark tool used especially for the suppression, control, and intimidation of women. The Inquisition courts burned thousands of people alive, drowned them, and tortured them using so-called evidence. Moreover, this was happening not only in rural areas, but also in cities, towns, and even in the shadow of palaces. Sometimes the jealousy of a neighbor, sometimes the suspicion of a priest, and sometimes the imagination of a child prepared the end for people. And the public often remained silent about what was done under the name of this purification, because to remain silent was to keep one alive. The church was the manager of fear in this period. It darkened thousands of lives with the edicts it issued to clean out the representatives of the devil on earth. With documents like Vox in Rama, cats, women, and the elderly were declared allies of the devil. These documents incited the fears of the public. The result? Mass hysteria, lynchings, and the smell of burning bodies. Every questioning eye, every free soul, every unusual behavior was a threat, and threats had to be destroyed. Not just living, but even breathing was risky. When the question, quote 1.4, was asked, the answer you gave did not matter, because the accusation itself was the punishment, and most of the time you wouldn't even have the chance to respond. Witch stories, which seem like fairy tales to us today, were deadly realities for that period. Stakes erected in the middle of fields, executions carried out before the eyes of the public, and those days when fear was sanctified were carved into history as one of the dark pages of humanity. And the only thing shining in this darkness was fire. Although the Renaissance seems bright, events like these show that fear grew alongside knowledge. Those who were against knowledge used the oldest weapon in their hands: rumor. A war started with a rumor, brought death upon the innocent like rain. If you had lived in that period, just speaking too much could have taken you to the stake. That is why, while reading history, one must hear not only the developments, but also these silent cries. Because sometimes the greatest tragedies start from the quietest whispers. If you are a woman, surviving is even more challenging. When you opened your eyes in the morning, the world you would experience if you were a man was already difficult. But if you were a woman, things were even darker. Being a woman in Renaissance Europe meant your fate was written by others from the moment you were born. You were not an individual. You were the carrier of the family's honor, the property of your father, and the servant of your husband. Women had no voice. They only had roles shaped in the shadow of fears and superstitions whispered into ears. In this world, if you were a woman, you could be considered punished just for being born. Women's access to education was almost non-existent. Knowing how to read and write was a luxury an ordinary woman could not even dream of. They were expected to be silent, not to develop their intellects, express opinions, or have a say in society. A woman's greatest virtue was being obedient. If you were different, talkative, or curious, this brought you one step closer to being a witch. Because society was inclined to see a woman who did not fit the norms as either insane or a servant of the devil, women were usually married off at a very young age. It was ordinary for someone to be betrothed at 14 to 15 and to have given birth to 5 children before turning 30. Dying during childbirth was quite common. There was no medical help. You couldn't trust anyone but midwives. And if your birth didn't go normally, it was believed that you were a sinner and that God was punishing you. In other words, while writhing in pain, you were excluded, both physically and spiritually. Women were not really allowed to work either. If you came from a noble family, you were busy with sewing and praying at home. If you were from the lower classes, you worked in the field and sold goods at the market. But despite this, you were still responsible for protecting your honor as the woman of your house. The tarnishing of honor was possible even with a rumor. Being seen alone with a man, saying a wrong word, or even laughing could push you out of society or even lead to being lynched. One of the most terrifying experiences of women in the Renaissance was their relationship with the church. The church saw woman as the source of sin. With the belief that Eve deceived Adam, every woman was perceived as a potential threat. Therefore, women were not trusted. Therefore, women had to be suppressed. Women were frequently subjected to torture and interrogations, as witches thought to have made a deal with the devil. Even just trying to survive was sometimes a crime. Being a woman also meant being invisible. Beside the men whose names we see in history books, how many women are there? Women interested in art, writing poetry, or dealing with science were always in the background. Most of the time, they had to work under the name of a male relative. They were even forbidden from claiming their own works. Furthermore, the female body was constantly being monitored. What you would wear, how you would walk, and who you would talk to were determined by rules. Even women's clothes were shaped according to their social classes and moral values. Even the appearance of knees was considered a great immorality. And remember, the punishment for these immoralities could be physical violence, exclusion, or even death. In short, being a woman in Renaissance Europe was a constant struggle. Survival was not just filling your stomach, recovering from a disease, or surviving wars. Being a woman meant earning the right to survive every single morning. And unfortunately, this struggle usually took place in a prison woven with invisible chains. That is why, if you were a woman, surviving was even harder. Childbirth is a life risk. Neither the mother nor the baby is guaranteed. In a dim room, on a stone floor covered with straw, a woman is writhing with labor pains. There is neither a doctor nor a sterile environment around her. An old woman trying to help, probably the person closest to a midwife, is murmuring prayers with herbs in her hand. This is an ordinary birth scene in Renaissance Europe. While giving birth, women were not only experiencing the most miraculous moment of their lives, but also putting their lives at risk. Because here, birth was a process accompanied by prayers before celebrations and fear before hopes. And the worst was that surviving the birth was never guaranteed. In a period when medicine was not developed, women's health remained in the background, and even hospitals were sometimes death traps. Every birth was a potential preparation for a funeral. One of the greatest dangers women faced during birth was postpartum hemorrhage. While these bleedings require emergency intervention even in modern medicine, back then it meant an almost certain death warrant. Moreover, there were no life-saving options like blood transfusion or surgical intervention. Everything was left to the mother's endurance and God's will. Along with this, the risk of infection was quite high. The lack of hygiene awareness, midwives attending births one after another without washing their hands, and the cloths used being in filth. All these brought along a disease called childbed fever, which caused the death of a large number of women. Women were dying not during birth, but within a few days after birth from high fever, tremors, and blood poisoning. And these deaths were so common that they began to be accepted as normal even among the public. In the event of the slightest complication during birth, saving the baby, not the mother, was not the priority. On the contrary, most of the time, the mother was condemned to die, while the baby's survival was a matter of luck. The female body was seen as a tool prepared for refertility. Therefore, even if the woman died, she could leave other children to be born behind. At least that was the mentality. But in this story, not only women, but also babies were at great risk. Neonatal deaths were very common. It was seen so frequently for babies to die in the first weeks that some families wouldn't even give their children names immediately. If it survived, an identity would be given. This practice was the internalized result of a culture where death was expected. Additionally, feeding the babies was a huge problem. If there was no breast milk, there was no such thing as formula. Mixtures such as heated cow's milk or barley porridge mixed with water were given. These often killed the baby. While preparing for birth, women were generally equipped spiritually. Prayers were recited and help was sought from saints, because they had nothing else in their hands. The experience of midwives was important, but it had no scientific equivalent. They acted on superstitions spread by word of mouth among the people, believing that birth would pass exactly as it was written on one's forehead. Among all these difficulties, birth was also a matter of status. Giving birth to a boy strengthened a woman's position within the family, while giving birth to a girl was often a disappointment. Especially in noble families, bearing a male heir was considered a sacred duty. Even if a woman was exhausted both physically and mentally after giving birth, preparations for the next pregnancy would begin immediately. This cycle was often a vicious one that shortened a woman's lifespan. Although some women, especially those in the nobility, had slightly better conditions during birth, this did not protect them from death. Even the most expensive beds, the best midwives, or the most candles burned could not eliminate the dangers inherent in the nature of childbirth. Birth was a trial from which no one could escape. Although everything seems under control in today's modern delivery rooms, for a woman in those times, giving birth was like heading onto a battlefield. Whenever labor pains began, the women gathered around would pray, men waited in silence, and children were sent to another room, because everyone knew that life could find its end behind that door. And that is exactly why in the Renaissance, birth was not a miracle. It mostly meant a price, a war, and perhaps a farewell. Children die before they grow up. Life expectancy was at the bottom. Today, the years a baby will live as soon as it is born are almost like a lifelong guarantee. However, in Renaissance Europe, things were completely different. The probability of a child born here surviving was as random as a toss of the dice. Infant mortality was so widespread that families would not name every born child immediately. They would wait for days or even weeks to see if the child would live. Because those first weeks were literally a race against death, and most babies lost this race. Life expectancy was incredibly low by today's standards. The average lifespan was around 30 years in many places. However, this did not mean that people died at age 30. This low average resulted from the very high rate of infant and child mortality. The proportion of children who died before reaching age 5 was so high that a child's survival was seen as a miracle. Families had many children because they accepted from the start that at least half of them would die. There were many reasons forming this deadly picture. Foremost were infectious diseases. There were no vaccines, no antibiotics, no clean water. Simple diarrhea could cost a baby its life. Children often crawled in filthy streets and on uncleaned floors, living intertwined with microbes. Even the habit of hand washing was not common. If the mother's hands were dirty, every touch to the baby was a fatal risk. When the hygiene conditions during birth were added to all this, it was truly a miracle for newborns to keep their eyes open to life. Another great threat was hunger. Famines frequently broke out in Renaissance Europe. Especially in rural areas, agriculture was inefficient. Food preservation methods were primitive, and one bad harvest could cause thousands of people to struggle with starvation. Because babies could not be fed sufficiently, they could not develop and became vulnerable. Breast milk depended on the mother's own health. The milk of a malnourished mother would also be weak. This cycle turned into the inescapable gears of poverty. Medical knowledge was almost non-existent. No specific body of knowledge had developed for childhood diseases. When a child had a fever, they were wrapped in steamy cloths, prayers were read, and at most, herbal teas were given. Sometimes treatments like bloodletting, which would further weaken the body's already weak defenses, were applied. Doctors buried children quickly rather than healing them. Because a large part of society saw these deaths as fate and did not question them much. Society's view of children was also very different from today's. There was no concept of childhood in the modern sense. Children were seen as small adults and were put to work before they even started walking. However, this working life also made them more open to external threats. Although factory chimneys were not yet smoking, fields, workshops, and marketplaces were heavy on children's bodies. Children who fell, were injured, or became ill were often left to their fate without treatment. Children who survived among all these hardships were generally more resilient and tougher in build. Life trained them at a young age, making them immune to pain. However, no matter what, the survival of a child was always a miracle for families. That is why celebrations, naming ceremonies, and first step gifts made for children were much more meaningful. Because these were also celebrations of moving one step further away from death. Being a child in Renaissance Europe meant constantly engaging in a struggle for survival. Looking from today's sterile, sheltered world equipped with healthcare services, that period might seem inconceivable. But every line of history whispers how great the battles these little lives fought in the past were. A childhood where it was uncertain whether one would be alive tomorrow. Such was the reality of the Renaissance. Now think, if you had been born in that world, up to what age could you have lived? Art is everywhere, but education is exclusive only to the elite. Imagine being greeted by the morning light seeping through wooden beams as soon as you wake up. You are in an Italian city in the heart of the Renaissance. The traces of Michelangelo are at every street corner, and young people dance to music in every alleyway. Statues, paintings, frescoes. Yes, art was everywhere, but something was missing: education. Because that era was one that sanctified art, but was not very intent on sharing knowledge. Knowledge was power, and power was the right only of the chosen. The information circulating among the public was mostly hearsay. To be able to read the holy books, it was necessary to know Latin, and this knowledge was exclusive to nobles, clergy, and court circles. The number of people who could read and write was so low that if even one single person in a village could read and write, that person was considered a sage. The public, however, had to rely on stories told through pictures, church sermons, and legends, because no one had given them this right. If educational institutions existed, they were either church schools or academies established specifically for the children of wealthy families. Even the information taught in these places was limited. Subjects like philosophy and astronomy were mostly considered dangerous and were met with suspicion, especially by the church. Think about what happened to Galileo. He was nearly excommunicated for saying that the sun was at the center. The price of accessing knowledge was heavy. In this period, children of the lower classes learned craftsmanship instead of education. The son of a blacksmith became a blacksmith, and the son of a tailor became a tailor. Their lives were trapped in the class they were born into. For them, even dreaming was a luxury. They could not get books into their hands because books were both few and expensive. Copying a book could take months, and its price could be equivalent to a family's annual income. For women, the situation was even more dire. If you did not come from a noble family, learning to read and write was nearly impossible. Women engaged in art were exceptions and usually remained in the shadows of their male relatives. A woman becoming a painter, writer, or scientist was hindered by both religious and social obstacles. What was expected of them was only to marry and raise children. However, despite all this inequality, art was a marvel that the public watched with admiration. Stories were told in the frescoes of cathedrals. Music echoed in the marketplaces. Theaters were the entertainment of the rich, but sometimes they could reach the public. Art did not fill the place of education, but it provided a shred of hope. Because people could feel even if they did not understand. Some alert artists and thinkers strove to break this inequality. Renaissance humanists acted with a perspective that centered on the human being. There were those who wanted to share knowledge with the public, teachers who gave secret lessons, and thinkers who gave public speeches emerged. But this was also often punished. Today, when we look back, we see the Renaissance as an age of enlightenment. But that light illuminated only a narrow circle. The rest remained in the shadow. Education was a part of power and was not shared with everyone. That is why, while surviving was already difficult in that period, if you also wanted to access knowledge, you had to exert a much greater effort. In this world where art reached everywhere, but education belonged only to the chosen, even being curious was an act of courage in itself. If you lived in that period, art could have fascinated you. But unfortunately, you might have been born into the wrong class to truly grasp the meaning of that magic. Medicine is applied according to the stars. Your doctor is the same as an astronomer. Today, when you go to the doctor, they ask you questions. They request tests. They investigate the cause of the illness and treat you with a diagnosis based on science. But if you lived in Renaissance Europe, your doctor would not ask you your blood type or which bacteria you were infected with. Instead, they would ask which zodiac sign you were born under and which planet was in which house at that moment. Yes, you heard right. Medicine was practiced according to the stars. Doctors made diagnoses and planned treatments by looking at the positions of celestial bodies. Medical knowledge was intertwined with astronomy. So much so that a physician would surely have a star chart with them. At the basis of this understanding lay a deep belief that the human body was a reflection of the universe. The human body was evaluated according to 4 elements and 4 temperaments: air, water, earth, and fire. The imbalance of these elements was considered the source of illnesses. Doctors looked at the sky to understand how this balance was disrupted. For example, the position of Saturn was believed to cause melancholy, and Mars to cause anger. Therefore, treatment was applied with the aim of restoring not just physical, but also spiritual and cosmic harmony. Imagine you are a patient. Do you have a stomach ache? The doctor first asks for your zodiac sign. Then they try to learn the day and hour you were born. Then they examine the sky. In which house is the moon? In which sign is Venus? If the sky says this pain stems from an imbalance of the fire element, they start feeding you with cooling foods. They take blood, apply leeches. They might even suggest you stay hungry or pray if the stars say so. It is a method very far from modern medicine, but completely logical according to the belief system of the period. This intertwining with astronomy was at such an advanced level that many doctors were also astrologers. Students receiving medical education in universities took astronomy lessons and learned to read star charts. This turned medicine into a prophecy mixed with superstition rather than a science, especially since nobles wanted to be purified in a spiritual sense as well as physical. They had such methods applied with great seriousness. Royal physicians determined dates according to the positions of the stars while treating kings. They would even perform no medical procedures on certain days because there was no suitable energy on that day. And unfortunately, these methods often did not heal the patients. However, when people could not recover, the doctors were not blamed. The culprit was mostly the position of the stars. It was said that fate was such. The responsibility for the illness was loaded onto the heavens. Thus, neither the doctor's knowledge was questioned nor the accuracy of the method. While people writhed in pain, they looked at the sky, and the solution was sought there, as if the stars knew every illness and solved every pain. One of the most dangerous things in this period was medical intervention performed at the wrong time. It was believed that if bloodletting or leech therapy were done while the stars were in a bad position, the patient would die. Because of this, patients sometimes lost their lives before they could be intervened. But still, people continued to trust doctors, because there was almost no alternative. This helplessness further fueled the belief in the stars. The understanding that, quote, 15 had settled among the public. Although the Renaissance is known as an age of reason and art, such practices in medicine were still widespread. However, over time, science progressed. The microscope was invented, bacteria were discovered, and the foundations of modern medicine were laid. Now doctors began to diagnose by looking at cells, not stars. But for a long time, especially in villages and towns, this astrological understanding of medicine continued to live. For many people, the sky was still the most reliable guide. Although it sounds strange today, this was perfectly normal for the people of that period. Because access to information was limited, scientific methods had not developed, and fear was tried to be suppressed by belief in the unknown. Thus, medicine had turned into a kind of belief system rather than a science, and the stars were at the center of this system. People's struggle with illnesses had turned into a ritual dancing with the sky. Real treatment would come much later in the light of science. The war did not end. Every city is under constant threat. The Renaissance was a period when Europe emerged from the Dark Ages and was enlightened in art, science, and thought. But behind this enlightenment, there was a truth that remained in the shadows. War had never fully come to an end. Every city, every town, and even villages lived under constant threat. Borders were not clear. Power balances between kingdoms were fragile, and there was always the possibility of an enemy coming with land occupation or plundering. For people, peace was a temporary break given to war. The cities of that period were surrounded by high walls. Every wall, every tower reminded them that a constant threat was waiting silently. City gates were opened at certain hours of the day and closed when it got dark. Night patrols stood ready against potential raids. The public felt the shadow of war even in their sleep, because not only enemy armies but also gangs of outlaws, mercenary groups, and local rebels were a great threat to the cities. One of the greatest threats was long-lasting conflicts, like the 100 Years' War, whose impact crossed continents. This long war between France and England had directly affected the civilian population, not just the soldiers. Fields were burned, villages were emptied, and people were displaced en masse. Women and children had to protect their homes, with men going to war. Food shortages, epidemics, and security problems were part of an ordinary life. Even in times of peace, an atmosphere of tranquility did not prevail in the cities. Diplomatic relations were weak, and news of a king's death could bring about throne struggles, igniting the spark of a new war. Even inter-kingdom marriages had become elements of political bargaining. If a dispute arose, these marriages could become a cause for war, and the public paid the price for these political games with their lives. As defense technologies developed, wars became more destructive. Catapults, siege towers, and gunpowder-powered weapons were each strong enough to level cities. Therefore, the city folk had to cope not only with threats from the outside, but also with the new destruction brought by technological progress. Every new invention meant a greater threat. In rural areas, the situation was even more dire. Unprotected villages were usually the first targets of looters. While military units were busy defending the cities, the peasants were left to their own fate. This situation created great fear and helplessness among the people. People were forced to leave their homes and fields and migrate to places they found safer. This, in turn, brought about famine and housing problems. War also shaped the culture and value judgments of ordinary society. Young men were prepared for fighting from childhood. While women mourned their husbands who died in war, they tried to keep their children on their feet. Families were torn apart, and hopes were postponed. An entire generation grew up without knowing what peace meant. And in the midst of all these hardships, the only hope for the people was a miracle. Perhaps a peace treaty, or perhaps the mercy of a king. But that miracle often did not happen. Because in Renaissance Europe, war was not just an event, but a way of life. And survival was a struggle waged every day. Close your eyes. You are walking in the narrow streets of a city surrounded by walls. With every step, the stones under your feet remind you of the blood that flowed in the past. The sound of a horse's hoof comes from afar. Who knows? Perhaps these are the footsteps of a new war. If you are ready, let's move on to the next story. For criminals, there is torture, not justice. In medieval Europe, the meaning of justice for someone who committed a crime almost never overlapped with the concept of law as we know it today. It was a common practice for a criminal to be subjected to severe torture even before their guilt was proven. In those times, there was no principle such as the presumption of innocence. In fact, most of the time, it was impossible for a criminal to prove their innocence even under torture. Not truths, but confessions obtained through pain were valid. In this system, when a person was accused, it didn't really matter whether the accusations directed at them were true or not. What mattered was for the criminal to speak. This speech often came accompanied by shouts, screams, and outcries. Instruments of torture were applied to criminals not with proven methods, but with a sadistic pleasure. Driving nails into the body, breaking bones, branding with fire, or ensuring the person was torn apart by tying weights to their body were part of the understanding of justice of the period. And these tortures were often carried out in public areas. The public would witness these tortures. Children were taken to watch so that it would serve as a lesson. The sufferings of the criminal were turned into an element of entertainment, not just punishment. How much of the accusations were true would be discussed much later. after the criminal lost their life or confessed. And most of these confessions are full of cases where the criminal lied in the face of unbearable pain. People would reach a point of taking responsibility for others' crimes, not just their own, simply so the pain would end. In other words, the logic of the system was not to reveal the truth, but to find a scapegoat. This situation was seen very frequently, especially among those accused of religious heresy in witch trials. Torture was applied not only to adults, but also to youths and even children. In many cities, it was considered normal for children older than 12 to be punished, and the methods of punishment were not mitigated according to age. Besides, in some cases, torture was seen not as the criminal's punishment, but as a process leading to the actual punishment. That is, it was out of the question for someone to be released just because they were subjected to torture. Torture was a preliminary process that opened the door to execution after obtaining a confession. Judges, clergy, and the vast majority of the public thought these methods were fair, because God's justice could only be ensured through these pains. Mistakes could not be forgiven without suffering. With this thought, many innocent people were also ruined, because everyone thought to be doing the devil's work was condemned to suffer without question. Even the places where torture was applied were part of this order. Damp dungeons, dark cellars, narrow spaces smelling of soot, and stone walls where screams of pain echoed. The tortures performed here created not only a physical, but also a spiritual collapse. People could never be the same again after coming out of these rooms. Most would remain disabled, and some would lose their minds. One reason for the continuation of this terrible system was the public's belief in it. The belief that those being tortured deserved it relieved the conscience of society. There was a crowd that ignored another's permanent suffering by thinking their own pains were temporary. Therefore, torture was a part of not only justice, but also the social soul. When compared with today's legal systems, medieval justice was completely a show of power and fear. There was revenge, not justice. There was sentiment, not law. And most of the time, silence reigned, not truth, because the one in pain would not speak, and the one who could not speak could never explain their innocence. In the Middle Ages, being a criminal started with just a decision, but the actual hell began when the doors of the torture rooms closed, and within this dark system, someone trying to prove they were innocent was accepted as the greatest criminal, because to resist was to disrupt the order. For this reason, tortures silenced not only bodies but also consciences. If you live in a village, even who you are is not clear. There is no population registry. Now close your eyes and imagine yourself in a small European village in the middle of the 15th century. You wake up with the sound of bells in the morning. But who rang the bell? Is it you? Your neighbor? Did someone die or was someone born? Who has a record anyway? You have no birth certificate, no ID, and no system to track your family tree. You just exist. But you don't exist in the eyes of the state. You are the same in the eyes of the church, because you are a peasant, because you are an ordinary person. Population registry? That was something kept only for the royal family and churchmen. In this period, while even those living in cities barely had a record of existence, in rural areas, this situation was left entirely to personal memories. Your grandmother's birth date? It would be remembered only as just before the Great Famine, or with mystical references like when the red comet was seen. This means that anyone's age, right, property or inheritance was based almost entirely on rumors. Who you were was often about who knew you. The only assurance based on a written document was perhaps a church marriage, but even that was not always recorded. If you are a peasant, you are not even the owner of the land you live on. You exist like a tenant of the feudal lords. The house you live in is theirs. The field you work in is theirs. Even the child born to you is almost theirs. Because there is nothing registered in your name. No title deed, no marriage certificate, no inheritance document. There are only oral traditions. Only stories told by the elders of the village. But whenever an epidemic comes, a war breaks out, or you are missing, the state only remembers you at tax time. Even then, you are counted only as a het. Sometimes people would vanish instantly. Did they flee? Did they die? Did they go to another village? No one could know for sure, because they wouldn't be erased from anywhere. They hadn't been written down anywhere to begin with. Therefore, when a crime was committed, tracing it was almost impossible. Likewise, proving you were innocent. Are you looking for a witness? The only living person might be the perpetrator of that event. Because written law was merely at the level of a rumor for a large part of the public. Contracts? They usually remained only in words as well. And every new generation born in this system grew up in an unregistered void. No one except the state, the church, and the nobles could know exactly who was born, died, married, or had children, and when. Everything started with quote 18 and quote 19. For this reason, family ties were often ambiguous. The person you thought was your brother might turn out to be your cousin. The person you assumed was your mother might actually be your aunt. Because who was who lived mostly only through gossip. That's how the rural face of the Middle Ages was. Your identity was ambiguous, and your existence glided through time like an unprovable shadow. You would die and pass away, perhaps without your name being written in a church ledger. Perhaps no one would even remember that you existed in this world. So, turn around and take a look now. Even today's official identities, birth records, and genealogies were quite valuable, weren't they? Because once, even having been born required proof. Traveling was like suicide. You could be robbed, you could die. In the world we live in, boarding a plane, hopping on a bus, or crossing from one city to another by car is just a matter of time and budget for most of us. But now, close your eyes and imagine yourself in Renaissance Europe. Every step is danger. Every crossroads is the unknown. That travel experience offered to us today as tourism was virtually a matter of life and death in that period. Because traveling was literally flirting with suicide. First, let's start with the state of the roads. No asphalt, no signs, maps are incomplete, and most importantly, there is no security at all. Even the main roads are seas of mud or narrow paths carved by horse-drawn carriages. Especially if you fell into forested areas, the only living beings besides you when night fell would be the bandits roaming in the moonlight. Moreover, these bandits wouldn't just take your money. They would take your clothes, your food, your horse, and if you weren't lucky, your life. Robbery was not a possibility. It was almost a certainty. And what about accommodation? There was no concept like a hotel. There were inns, but most of these inns were dark, filthy, and unsafe. Beds were full of bedbugs and rats. Your food could have been poisoned. Your wine was watered down, and you could never know what kind of deal was being made or what kind of fight was brewing in the next room. Even sleeping at night required courage. If you got sick, good luck. It was almost impossible to find a doctor in the places you went as a traveler. Moreover, diseases spread faster to foreign bodies. because your immunity was defenseless against local microbes. An injury or infection could result in death within weeks when left untreated. Even the simplest knee wound could lead you to death. Furthermore, there was no such thing as an identity. If something happened to you in a village, there would be no one who knew you. Even if a crime were committed and you were innocent, there was no paper or digital recording system to prove who you were. Saying quote_20 would not be enough. If you were found dead, your name wouldn't even be remembered. You would be buried in an anonymous grave. And of course, travel was even harder for women. A woman setting out on the road alone was almost automatically labeled as having fallen into a bad path. There were risks of sexual assault, kidnapping, or forced marriage. Most female travelers either disguised themselves as men or traveled in large groups. It was considered a miracle for a lone woman to reach her destination safe and sound. Additionally, customs, tax points, barricades set up by small kingdoms, and lords demanding passage permits were the icing on the cake. You might have to pay a separate tax for every single passage. They could seize the goods you carried, your clothes, or even your animals. Traveling was not only a risk, but also a serious financial obligation. And finally, the lack of information. You have no information about where you are going. No guidebook, no internet, no previously taken photograph. Perhaps someone who had been there before told you something, but its accuracy is unknown. In other words, setting out was walking toward the unknown, and death might be waiting for you at the end of this unknown. Today, we see travel as comfort and pleasure. Yet, in Renaissance Europe, this was a challenge requiring courage, survival skills, and a bit of luck. Imagine living in an age where you risked your life with every step for the sake of the information, trade, or faith you would reach at the end of the journey you set out on. In this age where journeys have turned into a song, a film, or an Instagram post, one must send a greeting to those intrepid travelers of the past, because they were truly on the road and face to face with death. The Renaissance looks beautiful, but if you step out of it, you cannot survive. The Renaissance period. An age adorned with art, science, and music, shining almost like the golden age of humanity. Elegant faces in paintings, divine scenes in frescoes, new ideas in books. Looking back from today, it is a time slice that often makes one say, I wish I had lived in that period. However, behind that grace, that aesthetics, and intellectual explosion lay such dark, such harsh realities that if you, as an ordinary person of today, fell into that period, it would be a miracle for you to survive for more than a week. First of all, you should know this. The period we call the Renaissance was not just an era where the likes of Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Galileo lived. It was also a time when thousands of people were burned for nothing, epidemics roamed the streets, and the majority of society was illiterate. There was no freedom, no expression. The opinion of an ordinary person carried no value. Art may be beautiful, but it is hard to hold a brush on an empty stomach. Science may be important, but ideas that could not cross the church walls were left to suffocate. When we think of the Renaissance, we always imagine intellectuals walking through the stone streets of Florence. But what about the common people? For them, the Renaissance meant very little in daily life. A peasant would go to the field before the sun rose. They would work all day. If they got sick, they went to the priest, not a doctor. Because the knowledge of doctors was limited to star charts, because there was no literacy, no communication, no transportation. The magnificence of the Renaissance was only for those who had direct access to that splendor. Cleanliness was an almost unknown concept. In many Renaissance cities, there was no sewage system. People would pour their waste out of the window. Therefore, you never knew what might suddenly fall on your head while walking down the street. You would walk through human waste, not mud, on your shoes. Soap? It was considered a luxury item. It was only found in the homes of the rich. The poor lived for months, maybe years, without washing. This created an ideal ground for diseases to spread. Being a woman, it was complete torture. A life deprived of education, devoid of rights, in the shadow of a man. Young girls were married off before they were even teenagers and faced the risk of dying in childbirth. Childbirth itself was a cause of death. There was neither a sterile environment nor a specialist doctor. A midwife or an old woman would come and deliver the baby with prayers. If you died, it was called fate. If you survived, you were considered lucky. The justice system? Forget that too. If you weren't rich or under the protection of a noble, you were considered guilty even if you weren't. Evidence? Witnesses? There were no such things. Even a mere rumor was enough for a person to be burned, hanged, or sent into exile. Especially for women, the situation was even more disastrous. Accusations of witchcraft were made so easily that living alone, owning a black cat, or going out at night was enough to make people think you were a witch. Did you decide to travel? Be careful. In Renaissance Europe, being robbed, kidnapped, or even killed on the roads were ordinary occurrences. There were no safe roads. Journeys lasted days or weeks. There were no maps, no road signs. If you didn't have a guide with you, arriving somewhere was almost impossible. Moreover, accommodations were not safe. The moment you were a stranger, everyone could count you as a potential threat. Let's say you wanted to take solace in art, but if you weren't an artist, art was still far from you. Do you want to read a book? In a society that cannot read and has no books, this is not possible. Libraries were only around the church or the palace. The public had no chance to access information. The most they heard were church sermons, and those were generally built on obedience, fear, and sin. As a result, a giant darkness lies behind that glorious painting of the Renaissance. Of course, this period was a great turning point for art and science. But for ordinary people? No. For them, this era was a time when even survival was a luxury. If you are saying, quote, 22, while looking back at the past, think again, because you are looking at the Renaissance from the outside. If you stepped inside, you probably wouldn't have survived. While seeking the light of history, one must not forget its shadows. If these dark but educational adventures interest you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications.